Very good. Thank you, Beth, and welcome everyone. I appreciate you joining us this morning. April 15, we are on our ACEL 2 extension for this month. We have been doing this now for, oh my gosh, is it 6 or 7 months, Beth? It's been great.
Since September.
Yeah, since September that we've been doing this. It's
been 6 months.
Yeah, been a nice partnership between ACEL and OSU Extension. Been a nice way for the department to kind of give us some specific content for extension that we've, I think, really been benefiting from, and it's been a great partnership for us to work on. So just for any of those who are maybe not as familiar, a little bit newer, the ACEL stands for the Department of Agricultural Communication, Education, and Leadership. And we have been having their faculty members lead these sessions for the past 6 months or so. So we appreciate you being here. And as most of you know, since you've registered, but today we do have youth leadership and empowerment, creating a culture of engagement. We have Dr. Jera Niewoehner-Green to present this for us this morning. I apologize for some noise. That's my 3-year-old running in the background. So without too much further ado, I will turn it over to you, Jera, and let me know if you need anything, and Beth is here as well. So thanks so much.
All right, hi everybody. So this was initially going to be the end of March, and it was postponed because that was when everything started happening. Daycare closed. My baby was teething at the time. I mean, it just felt completely impossible. So now my 8-month-old and I have a little bit better workflow going on. And he, as I mentioned before, he's sleeping in the swing at the moment, but at any point during this hour that could change. So I'm sure a lot of you understand, but just that's my little disclaimer there. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here and get this started. All right, sorry. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and turn off my camera just so that I'm not as quite as distracting. But that's me. That's what I look like when I'm not wearing yoga pants every day to work. But I was a high school educator for 10 years. I worked in Metro Nashville public schools. And so I taught Spanish and leadership development. So that's really where I got into leadership education. Worked on a lot of service learning projects with my students, as well as diversity and social justice education by partnering with some nonprofits. And the health department was also one of our school partners, so we did projects with them as well. And I also coached cross country and tennis. So kind of worked with students in a lot of different contexts. But from teaching leadership at the high school level, that's where I continued my education. I got my master's in community development and then my PhD in leadership. So I really look at leadership development a lot in community contexts. But I think it's important to also tell you a little bit about how I view leadership as an educator. I believe that leadership is available to everyone, and that it's a process. It's not just a position, but it is this activity that we engage in. And sometimes I might be stepping up to be in a leadership role, and then someone else is stepping up. And so we're kind of engaging in this process together, sometimes as leaders and sometimes as followers. But also important is that power and leadership are just inextricably linked. And oftentimes that's not talked about a lot. And I think when we think about youth in leadership and empowerment, it's important to talk about power and who has the power and who's making decisions. And also who our leader prototypes are, so who we might have in our head as who should be leaders often influence who we then support as leaders or develop as leaders. And so there's some bias that can be introduced there. So when I'm teaching my classes, that's one thing that we do talk about. Like, what are some of these prototypes that we might not even have thought about fully? How are they influencing then how we support certain people as leaders and develop them? I think that's also important to think about when we are working with youth. So today I'm going to start with some approaches to youth development, not spend much time there, talk a little bit about youth leadership, some empowerment frameworks, and then I really want to open up some space to hear from you all, the experts in the field, and how you've kind of seen some of these frameworks in action And also then just mention a few activities that could be used to develop leadership skills and empower youth. So I don't want to spend too much time here because a lot of you all live youth development and you've been exposed to these different approaches. But just to kind of start off, there are different approaches to youth development. Prevention approaches were really developed to keep youth from doing something, and it kind of grew out of public health and epidemiological approaches to disease prevention. And so when we think about those, we're thinking about dropout prevention programs, anti-smoking campaigns, and the DARE program, which failed miserably, even after years and years of implementation. Intervention approaches really kind of grew out of interests and problems of juvenile delinquency. And this was about trying to fix youth for doing something. So they messed up, how can we now rehabilitate them? So we think of gang diversion programs or truancy interventions. PYD is where, of course, if you're involved in 4-H, it's where you live. So this is preparing youth to do something. So instead of thinking about delinquency and deficit-based perspectives, thinking about what are the assets that youth have. So supporting their full potential is really the best way to prevent problems. And then focusing on intellectual development, psychological and emotional development, social development. And so of course we know that the 4-H incorporates PYD. Other examples might be Youth Build or Big Brothers Big Sisters, Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. And then youth and governance is another approach to youth development. This is supporting youth in doing something now, so where they have more voice and are part of that decision making and mutual respect for and by youth. And thinking about what are these benefits to having youth involved to organizations and communities at large. So examples of this might be youth serving on decision-making bodies or them actually developing and evaluating programs. And so, you know, within 4-H as well and some other youth programs, you can also see this level of engagement in using this approach to youth development. So when we think about youth leadership, it's part of youth development approaches, especially PYD and youth and governance. But as I mentioned before, leadership is not just a position as an officer or a team leader. It's a process. So to develop someone as a leader, there are several different domains that we have to consider. And that as leadership educators and youth practitioners when we are developing programming. So youth leadership has kind of been considered as both this internal and external capability. So something that's within and some actions that are happening with others. So now there are enough definitions of leadership. There's tons of definitions of leadership out there. And so this is kind of pulled from several different sources that looked at how they were defining youth leadership. I don't necessarily see how defining youth leadership is much different than defining leadership in general. So thinking about this ability to lead others and work together towards a common goal or vision, envisioning that goal or needed change, taking initiative, taking responsibility for outcomes, working well and relating to and communicating effectively with others. So those are just some of those abilities within leadership that I think you would think are very similar to adult leadership as well. So when we think about these different domains that we need to support, leadership is a little bit more complex than we might think. So when we think about these domains of leadership development, the leadership capacity is really these overarching knowledge, skills, and abilities that are related to the role or the leadership process. So the capacity reflects whether someone can do something and not necessarily that they will, but do they have the ability to? So the form of leadership capacity is really contingent on what is valued in a particular context or leadership role. So if within a certain context, being a good public speaker or being assertive are important for the role or organization, then that's where the training might be focused on, as well as what an individual might seek to learn and become. So context really matters here. Going around to the right, leadership enactment is really this capacity. So these knowledge, skills, and abilities put into action. So this is this functional practice. And how effective someone is in their enactment is really dependent on their capacity and what they know and are able to do. So when we think about incorporating leadership programming, we might want to think about what are opportunities to enact leadership and to practice some of those knowledge, skills, and abilities. Leadership motivation is, this affects a leader or a leader-to-be's decision to engage in leadership, whether that's training or engaging in roles. And it'll affect kind of their intensity of effort at leading and their persistence in leading. So the motivation might be that they enjoy it and it's tied to their personal identity, or it could be more non-calculative. And so there might be a lack of fully examining the cost or benefits associated with leading. So they kind of just take something on and then realize more of what it entails later. Or it could be a sense of duty or greater obligation to become a leader. So when we think about youth leading, and perhaps those that are maybe not having follow through or giving up easily, you know, we can kind of think about, well, what are kind of those motivations to take on these roles or to lead in the first place? And then finally, leadership efficacy. This is related to those internal beliefs regarding one's likelihood of success with a particular task. And so this is really a critical determinant on whether or not an individual is going to enact leadership behaviors and actually engage in that way. So there's actually a difference a little bit between leader efficacy and leadership efficacy as well. So if someone, leader efficacy is more about these internal beliefs about serving in a formal positional role. So this could be higher if like there's a role that's very scripted and someone has seen someone do the role several times, could have very high efficacy there. But leadership efficacy is really more about those beliefs associated with group processes. So extending beyond specific roles. So feeling that you could be successful in leadership behaviors such as delegating or making decisions, motivating others, and managing conflict. So when we think about leadership development, there's actually a lot of different pieces that can be involved there. And I think you'll see a little bit here when we look at what some research has told us about effective youth leadership programs and what they entail. You can see some of those reflections of those domains here. So first, you know, with that capacity piece, including knowledge and skills related to leadership, including history and values and beliefs of communities. We're thinking about that context in which a young person might be engaging in leadership. Teaching different leadership styles, teaching that awareness and acceptance of people and cultures, engaging in experiential learning, providing service to others, self-reflection, collaborative experiences, and opportunities to engage in different types of roles. So I mentioned that leadership is more than just a formal position. There are also informal ways to lead as well. And so opportunities to kind of emerge as a leader or work in groups in that way. So I wanted to also bring in this idea of empowerment because this relates to both youth development and leadership as well. So when we include the active participation of youth in planning, delivery, evaluation of programming, as well as taking the lead on issues that matter to them, this is really rooted in empowerment theory. And so empowerment theory focuses on the process of individuals gaining power in order to improve their life circumstances. So there are as many definitions to empowerment as there are to leadership, but I just wanted to kind of share a few here. And I want to note that, you know, my study of empowerment is really rooted in community development. But as I started that study, I was working in a school. And so I really see schools and youth programs as fundamental elements in community and that can be involved in community change. So a few definitions of empowerment. You know, one from Rappaport, mechanism by which people, organizations, and community gain mastery. So that's gaining control over their own lives. Ozer and Bandura really saw it as part of this efficacy piece. So this people's belief in their ability to do something. And then Zimmerman, who has done a lot of work around youth empowerment, he really talks about this psychological piece and thinking about competence and efficacy and this willingness to be involved. And he focuses a lot on leadership and also thinking about like the social environment. And a lot of it specific to youth. Oops. So empowerment, like leadership, is a process. It occurs in communities, and communities aren't necessarily just geographical communities. They can also be communities of interest. So I like to think that a youth program or an organization can be considered a community in which empowerment can occur. Empowerment involves active participation and this critical reflection, awareness, and understanding of the context and what's going on. And then this access to and control over important decisions and resources. So when we think about how youth can become engaged in improving their life circumstances as well as improving their community or perhaps their programs, over the years, scholars and practitioners have developed some frameworks that can kind of guide our thinking when we are developing programming and projects. So this first one here, I wanted to know if any of y'all had seen Hart's Ladder before, because it's been around quite a while. I don't know if we can engage in the chat here. Let's see if I can see it. But has anyone seen Hart's Ladder before or utilized this? Okay. Oops, go back. Sorry. Okay. So a couple of folks are saying no, some people have said yes. So kind of a mix there. Okay. So I have seen Hart's Ladder come up in some 4-H sites that I've looked at, sometimes used for volunteer training. But a couple of these frameworks that really can be used to kind of uncover, you know, how many activities and programs are designed at non-participation and participation levels. So the way that Hart kind of conceptualized this is looking at these lowest rungs of these ladders are really where youth are not involved at all. And then those higher rungs are the degrees of participation. So if we started at the very bottom, that's the lowest rung, and that's when youth are just consulted but not given feedback at all. So sometimes this could be like, hey, once you come up with your ideal playground, and then the drawings are collected, and then they're kind of never consulted again. So the children have no idea how their ideas might have been used. Going up, decoration is often when, you know, children might be wearing something for a cause, or they may perform at an event, but they really don't know a lot about what that cause is, and they don't have any say in the organizing. Tokenism is where children might be given a voice, but they don't have a choice of how they're communicating it. So sometimes we might see young people on conference panels, but they haven't necessarily been involved in the planning, or they might not even know a whole lot about why they're there. When you move up the ladder, that's when you're approaching more genuine participation. So assigned but informed is when youth understand the intentions of a project, they know who made the decisions concerning their involvement, they have a meaningful role, and they volunteer for the project, and they know why they're they're engaged. Consulted but informed is when the project is designed and run by adults, but children understand the process and their opinions are treated seriously. One example that Hart gives, back in the day, Nickelodeon used to actually have ideas for television programs, and they would consult with youth, and then they would bring them back and kind of show them again, and then they would be critiqued by the youth and then redesigned again, and kind of continue to go through this process with them, so that youth were part of the program design, the show design process all the way through. And then adult initiated shared concerns with children is considered true participation, because even though the projects are initiated by adults, the decision making is really shared with young people. So Hart kind of said, a lot of times community projects are not shared by all, that often this dominant group of people from like 25 years old to 60 years old kind of dominate a planning process. But the goal here is really to involve as many people as possible, which is going to include young people. And then child initiated and directed. This is a little bit different from working on a project where the steps are already laid out for someone to complete. But Hart mentions that sometimes it's difficult to find examples of this because oftentimes adults kind of struggle to really give up that control. So he gives the example of, like, even when adults leave children alone to design and paint a wall mural, it's sometimes hard for them to not intervene and keep coming in and directing and saying, oh, no, we should do it this way, or maybe we should change this. And then finally, the child initiated and shared decisions with adults. This is where young people have the ideas, they set up the project, and then they actually invite adults in to join with them in making the decisions. So this is kind of Hart's idea of, what these levels of participation can look like. And so empowerment would happen as you kind of go up the rung of the ladder, because young people have more control over how they're engaging. So Shire really kind of built on Hart's ladder, and I do have the links to all of these in the references too, because I know that the writing's a little small. But Shire only included participation rungs and not these non-participation rungs of Hart's. So I don't know if anyone has also seen this one, but I think that this one's a little bit helpful because it presents some questions to kind of assess levels of youth participation going all the way up. So it shows those different rungs, but then provides questions such as, are you ready to support children in expressing their views? Do you have a range of ideas and activities to help children express their views? And kind of doing a little bit of evaluation of what a program might look like. However, one critique about his model is that these responses are coming from an adult, right? So these are adult questions that they're asking about their own program and not necessarily engaging young people in that process. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this one, but I do like that it's framed in questions so that you can assess. But both Hart and Shire's model are very linear and kind of assume that each rung is this progressive step towards ideal youth-driven participation. But youth-driven participation may not be appropriate in all instances because there's often a need for adult involvement for optimal adolescent development and empowerment. So youth might lack skills, expertise, and connections to social capital that they would need to conduct an activity without getting really frustrated. So although I think these are good frameworks to really get specific about what might be happening with youth engagement, there's one final one I wanted to share with you that kind of looked at pluralistic or shared control as actually more optimal ways to engage youth in that way. So they chose empowerment as this framework because they really felt that it was important to enhance wellness and the sense of control and that it's being strengths-based. So The assumption here is that, you know, through the empowerment process, individuals are going to gain power in order to improve their life circumstances. So whether that's being their environment or their community or their program, youth are becoming engaged to make something better. So here, the way that they do the pyramid is they kind of show adult control on the left and full youth control on the right. And conceptualizing this pluralistic piece as being the ideal kind of optimal ways to engage. So if we start on the left and look at the vessel and symbolic levels of participation, sometimes youth can definitely benefit from like a traditional pedagogical relationship with adults, especially if it's about learning a certain type of skill or teach something that's very specialized. But this relationship is really kind of, adults still hold the power. And so some kind of vessel types of participation we often see in schools, and sometimes we will often see in programs where there's just direct teaching that's going on, and students are just the recipients of being taught those knowledge and skills, and they don't really have a say. In symbolic types of participation, this might be more like having youth on organizational boards or advisory committees and research projects, and youth do have a voice. However, sometimes they may not have a lot of power in the decision-making or agenda-setting process. So in the shared or pluralistic level, this is when youth are really encouraged to be active collaborators. So they're able to share their views while gaining further awareness about culture or history, or learning more about their community, and how all of that has really kind of shaped who they are and their life experience. And so when they're active collaborators, what research tells us is that that can help increase those developmental assets such as competence or self-efficacy and a sense of control, because they are increasing their awareness around their environment. And what's important here is that adults are sharing in that control, so that adults are able to connect youth to resources if they need it. Adults may have more social capital, so they're going to have more relationships, and they may have more experience to share with youth, and so they're kind of both learning in that space. As you kind of go down into more of the youth control, that independent level was really this response to traditional vessel participation types. So although this approach has been recognized for enhancing youth independence, it's also been criticized for having a lack of adult involvement. So youth might have a lot of ideas, but lack expertise in developing and implementing a strategic plan, or may not be connected to resources. And then the autonomous, which youth have total control, which Hart would have seen as kind of the ultimate. This is, we would see where youth have really taken measures to create their own spaces for voice, regardless of adult involvement. But there's no type of consent or guidance from adults. So the critiques here are kind of similar to independent, and then there's a disconnect from resources that adults can bring, as well as a segregation between youth and adults. So those are kind of some frameworks that can kind of guide thinking as we think about projects and programming, and how are we actually engaging youth in different ways. And when we want to think about, well, what are the ultimate outcomes here? Is it about just teaching certain skills, or is it about developing some leadership capacity, giving opportunities to enact leadership, and actually giving or helping to empower youth so they have more of a sense of control over their life and what's going on in their community. So I really wanted to kind of hear some examples now that we've seen some of the frameworks, and I really kind of rudimentarily summarized kind of some different levels here. But what are some examples from the field that you have of engaging youth at these various levels? So we can think about, you know, when youth have input, but adults ultimately make the decisions. Youth have input, and then they're making decisions along with adults. Youth have most of the control, and there's just adult supervision. Or youth have total control and maybe just invite adults' input in. So either using chat or sharing out, I would love to kind of hear some of your examples of engaging youth in these different ways.
I think for the youth I'm over right now, we're kind of in a transition. When I stepped in, there are youth on our advisory council, but it was very difficult to get them to attend or even be a part of it. And I still have yet to convince my adults that their decision making is important. I think my adults agree that their attendance and their how do I say this? Appearance at a council meeting or advisory meeting is important, but I think they struggle with them actually making decisions. So I think for me, we're still in a transition of getting the rest of my adult volunteers to understand that youth have the ability to make positive decisions for our program.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that's one of my next slide is asking about, you know, what are some of those challenges there? And sometimes it's like, yes, can adults actually believe in the ability to make decisions, and can they be okay with the decisions that are made?
At Youth Outdoors, we have a unique approach with our horseback riding program in that we have kids that are nominated and interview and that sort of thing to be on the horse committee. And we have a equal number of adults and kids, and the decision as to who will be promoted to the next level in horseback riding and what sort of programming we will do and evaluation, the kids have the same voice as the adults and the same voting power.
Yeah.
So that's probably, I'm thinking that in hearts, that would be like a 6.
Yeah, probably somewhere. And, you know, that's one of the critiques, right? Is that, is it always have to be at the top? Because there's some learning, you're kind of working together, right? If you've got that equal participation, then it maybe the adults are able to offer some guidance in how you are making those decisions, but then the youth have the equal amount of say at the end.
And we start at the one level 1 in that we're teaching them about how to ride horses, and we're teaching them, you know, about care and that sort of thing. And so we definitely start there, and it takes a couple of years before they can get to that being a part of the horse committee.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good point, is that when we're looking at these frameworks and thinking about these levels of engagement, that you can't necessarily just start off with these full levels of participation. But if these are the goals and we can think about how we work there, then yes, because it can take months, it can take years. Good example.
I think to go off of that, I'm kind of in a similar position as Justin, kind of starting new, trying to convince people to allow the kids to make decisions. But I know, like with our junior fair board, I have a set of advisors who work on that, and they're always like, well, the kids need to decide, the kids need to make this big decision. And it's like, well, maybe the 14-year-old that just joined isn't quite ready to do that yet. So I think that's a really good point of like, not only teaching them, yes, the kids should have control, but we also need to guide them through a process first. They don't just automatically know how to do it.
Right, right. Yeah, so there's, you know, some knowledge that needs to be taught there, and some, you know, processes that need to be learned. Because, you know, for any of us, you know, we can think about that for adults as well. When we're coming into a new position, we can't just be assume to kind of know everything that's going on. So sometimes reframing it that way can be helpful. Great. Here's some other examples.
For us in Licking County, I guess I would throw out the way that we work with our camp counselor team. With our teens who serve as camp counselors, they work in planning groups, and so they choose which activities and on which day, and in large part what sessions will be offered and things of that nature. And then what we do as adults is that we are there to answer questions and kind of help them process so that they make the best decision. In many cases, not all, but we're there to kind of help guide and create some parameters. But ultimately, what we do on a given afternoon is up to them to decide and then promote and work with the kids to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great example. Someone's awake over here, but I think we're still okay. Anyone else have some examples, kind of some of these different levels of youth participation?
In Cuyahoga County, we host a teen summit every year, and the teens get to develop workshops on topics that they're interested in, or that things that they see are happening in their neighborhoods, and they do the research, and then they host the workshops for their peers. And then the adults and our volunteers provide some input. We help them kind of reserve the room spaces and set things up, but it's really a teen-led effort. But at the same time, it's also difficult because they're not used to being asked what they want to see. So when we say, what do you care about? What are you really interested in? They don't always have an answer right away. So it's kind of like facilitating that knowledge gain and kind of an understanding of what they really care about. And that can take some time.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point there, because sometimes we wait until they're teens to start asking them what they care about. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, now you're asking me? And sometimes, our youth are just very aware about what's going on in their communities. Sometimes they may not have thought about it before. So being able to kind of incorporate some of those activities even earlier on, because I know I really struggled as a high school educator when we started to do service learning projects. A lot of times the youth that I was engaged in, this is the first time that they were given the opportunities to make some of those decisions and identify some of those needs. And so there was a lot of scaffolding that had to happen to get them to that point, because they hadn't necessarily been asked before. Any other examples? These are great.
I would say too, our community club programs, and I think the rest of you 4-H educators could echo this. I think we have clubs that meet every single one of these bullet points, depending on who's leading, who the advisor is. Some of my clubs totally put it 100% on the youth. Some of them, the youth make the decisions, but really it's, the adult's agenda sometimes. So I think we have a wide variety across the state of what our clubs are doing. Mm-hmm.
To add to that, I think sometimes the frustration is what are their intent for allowing the youth a certain level of responsibility, because sometimes I've got adults who are fantastic at allowing the youth responsibility because they know that's good for the youth and they'll be there to support them and sort of have that scaffolding and stuff. But other times, like Frances alluded to, her junior fair board, I have adults who allow the youth to make decisions so they can be a scapegoat when something goes wrong. And then, well, the youth made that decision. And so it's then their fault and the adult's not. Sometimes they're being supportive. And then that's I think sometimes difficult depending on the adult volunteer, the partner we're working with, because sometimes the intent of why those youth are being allowed those decisions or not changes it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So those are some good conversations to have as well, right? So when we're thinking about, okay, well, what do we want our outcomes to be? You know, what are we trying to instill in our young people through this process, the outcomes of this program, so that it's really clear why we're designing things the way that we are. Why is it that we want youth to have a voice here? Is it because we want them to be more empowered, or is it just because that's what we're supposed to do, or we think that's what we're supposed to do? So let's see, Erin said that when she works at-risk teens with SNAP Ed programming, the only way I can engage them is to give them power to decide how our lessons are going to go. Yes. And I also worked with at-risk teens as well as a high school educator. And so sometimes they need that space to have actually some power, right? That space could be one of the only places where they may have some power to actually engage and make decisions, instead of always being, because when we think about back to the type pyramid and that vessel, so when you totally have adult control, when we think about a lot of our schools, that's really how they were built. Paulo Freire, who talks a lot about education, talks about this banking system where it's just the teachers are just giving the knowledge. We're starting to see a lot of shifts now where students are becoming engaged in different ways. But oftentimes our young people are just used to just having to sit there and just get talked at, right, from whoever this expert is at the front of the room, rather than them being able to engage in their way and share how their experiences might contribute to understanding of the world. So when we think about how sometimes our youth might be taught in schools in those systems, you know, where is it that the power generally lies? So do program options, out of school time programs offer a different type of space?
So in Benton County, we have a youth-led prevention group. And,
Any other examples?
I'll talk about in Claremont County. This is Margaret Jenkins.
Hey, Margaret.
Hi there. And I'll talk about the Look to Ohio program. And I specifically, it has 3 components to it: a leadership course, service learning, and then also place-based learning. So with the service learning piece, our experience with that is that the more the young people are able to be involved in their development of their service learning project, the more effective it is. And when you were speaking of the adults in it being resources, that's the way it works the best, when they're a resource. We've had some times where the young people have tried to do it without the resources, and so what happens is they're not as successful as some of the other service learning projects that we've had. And so if others want to chime in about that, that's a nice piece.
I thought I heard somebody coming on. Did anyone else want to?
this is Travis from Benton County.
Hey, Travis.
Hi, Jera. So we have a youth-led prevention group. Myself and a public health nurse from the health department started in the high school. And so it was interesting as we made connections at the high school with one of the school counselors, and talked about sort of what our thought process was for guiding these youth through a planning process and delivering some education activities to peers within the high school. It was interesting that the public health nurse and I were very much about providing data, information, allowing kids to some decisions, plan some activities, with our kind of thought was giving them what we determined sort of a safe space with their peers to maybe not be 100% successful, because sometimes we can learn from those things that aren't so successful when it comes to planning. And I think we all know that sometimes when you have a group of teens, follow through is not always the best depending on those teens you have engaged. And so the school counselor really struggled with that. She had worked with groups in the school before, but she was always sort of coming behind them, picking up the pieces, making decisions and doing things because she wanted the event to be a success every time. And we were sort of 2 months into it, and we sort of had this conversation about, we're okay if it doesn't look great, and maybe sort of the angle she was coming from, that she thought it reflected upon her within the administration to say, if it's not successful, we're not going to give you the time again to do these activities in the school day. And so really having that discussion. And so she was totally on board, but I noticed as we worked with that group at various times, she would be sort of after the meeting checking in with myself and the other adult ally to say, should I be doing this, or should that something we should let the kids do? Sort of kind of taking that back, because we were okay with, it not being great. They're sort of in a safe environment. We're asking the important questions and getting to sort of think through some of the various scenarios and how things might happen, but knowing that it didn't have to be 100% a huge hit because they were doing it with peers within the high school. So it was just an interesting dynamic to kind of have 3 people, 2 of them in sort of the same place and 1 in a very different place about how that looks to work with a group. So
some really good examples there about how things are going to look differently when youth have more of a say, and that could be that they get a little messy sometimes, but other times you're going to have more engagement there. And I think that often that is the challenge, and that was kind of my next slide. You can kind of hear that there's a meltdown starting over here, so I'm going to leave you with this guy for just a second. I'm going to grab him. But I think several of you have already talked about this and what are some of those challenges. And, sometimes those challenges are then also working with adults that want that sense of control sometimes is linked to how they're going to be perceived, as in Travis's example with the counselor. And I saw a lot of that in the high school setting as well, because if things do fail, it ends up going back on that staff member, right, or on that teacher, or whoever that leader is. So I'm going to just pause for just a moment. I'm going to grab him, and then we'll finish up here. I'm going to mute this. So if y'all want to.
So one of the problems that we've had with Youth Outdoors is at our Water Adventure Club, we have kids that when we ask them to come up with what they want to do things like jump out of airplanes and, bungee jumping and some really, really adventurous stuff that I love their spirit, but we often have to give them a bit of a reality check that that's not something they're ready to do yet in our clubs. And it can be hard. I can see their defeated looks on their faces when we let them know we're not going to jump out of planes.
Yeah, you have some clear safety concerns there. So you're like, maybe we can get there one day, but not this year. Come here, buds. All right. Well, some of y'all gave some really great examples about what you're doing in your programs. And some are kind of included here. Here comes the cats. Everyone wants to be on the couch together. But when we think about program evaluation, that is another way to get youth involved. Whether that's them coming up with survey questions or interview questions, collecting some of that data, analyzing some of that data, and then working through a process where they are then helping to make some decisions on changes in programming, or if they're doing some interviewing or even helping with thinking of some of the outcomes. Also thinking about projects that might identify community needs and how to address them. Advocacy projects where where youth are able to advocate on behalf of another group that they would like to work with. Including leadership topics and self-determined projects and ways in which they can take on leadership roles within those. And then, you know, I mentioned kind of the traditional approach of training and teaching you skills, and oftentimes that's where things have to begin. But can there be extensions to that where then they are able to teach others what they've learned? So it's kind of think about it more as train the trainer instead of it just being the ending point where you're learning those skills. And then thinking about including like reflection and feedback loops to what those programs are, times for self-reflection. And some of y'all mentioned, you know, I think Travis mentioned with the project that you were working on, sometimes things don't go as planned and things get really messy, but being able to kind of talk through that and learn through that is one of the best ways to learn that, you know, project planning and implementation is not always going to go smoothly. And providing some of those feedback loops throughout that process and engaging youth in that so that they see that they are part of what is going on. So that is, I know I went a little fast with some of those frameworks and resources, but I did try to link things here, especially for those frameworks, gave the links there. This is for the type pyramid here, so that you can go to those. I hope that some of them could be helpful in terms of conversations that you might have with your volunteers or, you know, with some of your co-leaders in terms of when you're developing programming and thinking about what's working and what's not, and how to engage youth more, developing those leadership skills and also engaging in youth empowerment, supporting youth empowerment. So any other questions that you may have? This is Bodhi. Hey, everybody. Woke up from a nap. So, but any other questions or comments? Y'all had some great examples. All right, well, thank you, Diana. And thanks everyone for being here. Sorry I had to go so fast, but we're kind of working against the clock and the nap clock here. But thanks for tuning in, and hopefully I will be able to see some of y'all again in the future.
And thank you, Jera, for your expertise in sharing information with us today. I think it was very helpful, and I really enjoyed the conversation from everybody who chimed in and gave information about their programs or their thoughts about youth empowerment. So we will be sending out an evaluation, and I encourage you, if there's any topics that you would like to have us facilitate a webinar on, please let us know. We're planning next year. And so this is your time to chime in with what your needs are. Does anybody have any other questions, comments? Thank you, Bodhi, for being a good sport. I think we all have to have a lot of grace right now. So give you.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So everybody, thank you for taking time out today to be with us.
Okay. Thanks, y'all. Bye-bye.